7 days after her daughter killed a man in her home, Lana Turner walked into a Los Angeles courtroom and gave the greatest performance of her life. There was no script, no director, no second take. The love letters she had written in private, the ones a dead man's employer had recovered from his apartment and sold to the newspapers, were read aloud before a jury while she sat at the witness stand and listened. She did not look at the letters. She did not look away from the jury. For 2 decades, Lana Turner had been Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's most photographed woman, a name that moved ticket sales, a face that sold magazines, a story the studio had been writing since she was 15 years old and answering to a name that was not her own. Hollywood built her into someone men would want to own. It did not build in a way out. In the spring of 1959, 8 months after her daughter entered a reform school, a film opened in theaters across the country. Lana Turner played a woman who abandoned her daughter for the lights. America bought the tickets. It became the biggest commercial success of her career, but we'll get to that. Wallace, Idaho sits inside a mountain canyon so narrow that the main street is roughly the width of the town itself. In the 1920s, it was a silver mining settlement, modest, cold in winter, and organized almost entirely around the principle that extraction was what you did with valuable things. Julia Jean Turner was born there on February 8, 1921. Her father, Virgil, moved between odd work and gambling circuits. Her mother, Mildred, was practical and mobile in the way that poverty makes a person practical and mobile, always one calculation ahead of the next crisis, never quite far enough ahead of it. The family relocated to San Francisco when Julia Jean was still a young child, following the rumor of something steadier. There was no steadier. By 1930, Virgil Turner was dead, and Mildred was alone with a 9-year-old daughter and no particular reason to stay anywhere. Mildred kept moving. Los Angeles, 1936. A city that had spent the preceding decade perfecting the idea that a woman's face, correctly photographed, was a renewable resource. Julia Jean was 15 when a man named Billy Wilkerson saw her at the counter of a soda fountain near Hollywood High School, a cafe called Tops on Sunset Boulevard, on a Tuesday afternoon when she had skipped her typing class. The version of this story that became official, the one in the studio press releases and fan magazines, the one that would be reprinted for the next 30 years, placed the discovery at Schwab's Pharmacy, which was tidier, more cinematic, and largely invented. What is documented is simpler. A 15-year-old girl ordered a Coke, and a man who published The Hollywood Reporter recognized in her something the motion picture industry would find profitable. Wilkerson made a telephone call. MGM made an offer. In 1937, Julia Jean Turner signed with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the largest and most profitable motion picture studio in the world, an operation that had been manufacturing stars on an industrial schedule since the early silent era. A producer in the story department decided the name Julia Jean would not photograph well. They chose Lana, borrowed from a character in a novel one of the producers happened to be reading. She did not choose it. She signed the contract that came with it. She was 16 years old. The studio now owned the image. What MGM built over the following decade was precise and deliberate. A face that moved ticket sales, a body that sold magazine covers, a mythology of accidental discovery that made the entire transaction feel like destiny rather than commerce. She was coached, photographed from angles that had been tested on audiences, assigned roles with the efficiency that a factory applies to its most profitable product line. The studio chose her pictures, approved her interviews, and managed her public appearances with the attention that corporations give to their most important assets. Because that is what she was. In 1938, A photographer shot her in a fitted knit sweater for a promotional campaign. The photograph ran in newspapers across the country and generated a nickname that would attach itself to her for the rest of her professional life: the Sweater Girl. It was presented as a compliment. What it actually produced was a category, not a woman, a type. Something to be looked at, wanted, and, in the specific imagination of the American audience of that era, eventually possessed. The films came in volume after that. By 1941, Life magazine had called her the nightclub queen and put her on the cover. By 1946, she was cast opposite John Garfield in The Postman Always Rings Twice, a picture about a woman who agrees to something irreversible because a man has convinced her, steadily and skillfully, that there is no other way out. Critics praised her in the role. MGM used it to recalibrate her image. Now she was not merely desired, but dangerous, a woman whose beauty was an instrument that could get a man killed. The full irony of that casting would take another 12 years to arrive. Hollywood turned Lana Turner into a product, and like most products, she was built without a lock on the door. Beneath the public career, a private life was running on a parallel track, as it always does in these stories, and as it is always the private life that eventually determines how the public story ends. Between 1940 and 1958, Lana Turner would marry 7 different men across 8 marriages. The relationships did not tend to improve her circumstances. They tended to reproduce the arithmetic of her earliest years, an instability that resolved itself through loss, followed by the practical necessity of starting over, followed by the next man who seemed like a solution. In 1942, she had a daughter with her second husband, a restaurateur named Cheryl Crane. They named the baby Cheryl. Within 2 years, the marriage had dissolved, and Cheryl was being raised through an arrangement of grandparents, boarding schools, and household staff, because her mother was, above all things, a working actress in the MGM system, and the MGM system did not organize itself around children. The system organized everything else, and the children occupied the space that was left. In her memoir, published decades later, Cheryl Crane would describe the experience of growing up as Lana Turner's daughter with a precision that resists sentimentality. She wrote that she understood from an early age that her mother was not quite a person in the ordinary sense. She was Lana Turner, which was something considerably more visible, more demanding, and considerably less available. It is worth staying with that for a moment. By 1950, Lana Turner was one of the most recognized women in the United States. She was photographed constantly. Her name appeared in columns and on marquees and in the dreams of a particular generation of American men who had grown up with her face on the walls of their barracks during the war. She was, by every external measure, one of the most seen women in the country. She was also, by any sober accounting, a woman who had been arranged since the age of 15 to be defined by the men around her, by the studio that named her, by the culture that categorized her, by the specific terms of what the industry offered women in that era and what it made unavailable to them. She had been built into someone men would want to possess. No one had considered what would happen when one of them actually tried. In the early 1950s, Lana Turner married a man named Lex Barker. He was a broad-shouldered actor who had played Tarzan in 5 pictures for RKO, a man with the professional confidence of someone who had spent years being photographed as a figure of physical authority, and who moved into the household on North Bedford Drive in Beverly Hills with the ease of a person who had not been taught to question what he was permitted to take. Cheryl Crane was 10 years old when Lex Barker arrived. She was 13 when he left. What happened in those years is not a story the fan magazines printed. It is not a story MGM managed. It happened behind doors that no studio publicist had thought to check, and when it finally came to light, it would reframe every decision Lana Turner made in the years that followed, including the one she could not make fast enough to matter. The marriage to Lex Barker began in September of 1953 and was, by all visible evidence, a reasonable match for the era. He was 34 years old, classically handsome in the manner of actors who have spent years playing men of uncomplicated authority, and he had built his name playing Tarzan in 5 successive pictures for RKO, a hero whose defining characteristic was that nothing on earth threatened him. When Barker moved into the household at 730 North Bedford Drive in Beverly Hills, he moved with the ease of a man who considered himself a natural fit for whatever circumstances he entered. The circumstances at that point included Cheryl Crane, 10 years old, attending school, being raised primarily by her maternal grandmother while her mother fulfilled a schedule that MGM organized in 4-week production blocks. But before arriving at Lex Barker, it is worth understanding the full shape of what preceded him, because the marriage to Barker was not an anomaly. It was the 4th chapter of a pattern that had been running since 1940. That year, at 19, Lana Turner married Artie Shaw, a band leader, a genuinely gifted musician, and a man who had accumulated 2 previous marriages by the time he proposed to her. He was 30 years old. The marriage lasted 4 months. Shaw would go on to marry 5 more women over the course of his life, among them Ava Gardner and Kathleen Windsor. Collecting remarkable women appears to have been, for him, a kind of discipline that he never troubled himself to examine. In 1942, she married Stephen Crane, with whom she had Cheryl. That marriage collapsed within the year. In 1948, she married a millionaire named Henry J. Topping, the kind of wealth that had been in the family long enough to feel like gravity rather than achievement. That marriage lasted 4 years and produced, in the end, nothing except a gradual mutual disillusionment and a settlement. 3 husbands before she turned 32. The studio managed each divorce with the efficiency of a department that had done this before, because it had. The press releases described irreconcilable differences. The gossip columns described heartbreak. What was actually happening, if the record is read with any care, was something quieter and more structural. A woman who had been trained since adolescence to understand herself through the men who chose her, and who had not been given, by the studio, by the culture, by the marriages themselves, any other framework for understanding what she was, or what she was permitted to want. MGM gave her a new name when she was 16 years old. They did not give her a way out. Now, in 1953, there was Lex Barker. Before we go further, if you've found this story worth staying with, the kind of story that lives in the spaces history forgot to photograph, consider subscribing to this channel. It costs nothing, and there are more of these waiting. Now, back to 730 North Bedford Drive and what no one at the studio was paying attention to. What happened inside that house in the years between 1953 and 1957 was not printed in the fan magazines. It was not managed by MGM's publicity department. It happened in rooms that publicists had not thought to check, between a man who had been given the authority of a stepfather and a child who had not been given the vocabulary to describe what was being done to her. In her 1988 memoir, Cheryl Crane writes that her mother's 4th husband began abusing her sexually when she was approximately 10 years old and continued for roughly 3 years. This account rests on Crane's own testimony and cannot be independently confirmed. And a story this consequential deserves to be told without borrowing certainty it hasn't earned. What is documented, what is on the record, and what is not disputed by anyone who has examined this period carefully. Lana Turner divorced Lex Barker the day she was told. The day. Not a week later, after consultation with her attorney or her publicist or the studio whose opinion she had been conditioned to seek before any decision of consequence. The day. A marriage of nearly 4 years ended within hours of the conversation in which her daughter finally told her what had been happening. She did not press charges. There is no criminal proceeding on record. Lex Barker left the house on North Bedford Drive, went to Europe, and continued working. He would make 40 more films before his death in 1973, most of them in Italy and Germany, where his American name still carried commercial weight. The industry absorbed the information the way it absorbed everything that didn't fit the schedule, without ceremony, without consequence, and without interrupting production. Cheryl Crane was 13 years old. Run the arithmetic of her situation at that moment. By the time she entered adolescence, Cheryl had been managed between boarding schools and grandparents while her mother worked. She had watched 4 different men move through the household with varying degrees of permanence and authority. She had been abused by one of them for approximately 3 years, and she had watched the exposure of that abuse produce no lasting consequence for anyone, except, in the way these things inevitably land, for herself. She understood, at 13, something the fan magazine coverage of Lana Turner's life had never needed to address, that the world her mother inhabited was one in which men of a certain physical confidence were permitted to take what they wanted, and in which the women and children around them were expected to absorb the damage and maintain the appearance of the life the cameras expected to find. This is not a lesson Lana Turner intended to teach her daughter. It was, nonetheless, what the system had been teaching, through the contract signed when she was 16, through the name assigned to her by a stranger, through the marriages the studio tolerated or discouraged on the basis of how they moved in the press. For 20 years. The marriage to Lex Barker ended in 1957. Lana Turner was 36 and had been Lana Turner for 2 decades, the product, the brand, the woman whose face had been used to sell a version of femininity that was perpetually desired and perpetually available. She had a daughter she barely knew. She had been married 4 times, and she was, as she would later describe it, still looking for something she couldn't name, but was absolutely certain a man could provide. She met him in late 1956 at a dinner in Los Angeles arranged through a mutual acquaintance. He introduced himself as John Steele. He said he was in the import-export business. He was not in the import-export business. His actual name was Johnny Stompanato/Stompanato, and he had been sent, by some accounts, with something approaching a purpose. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, unhurried in conversation, and possessed of the specific ease of a man who had learned, in a professional context, that confidence was the first instrument you needed when taking something that wasn't yours. He had learned it working for Mickey Cohen. In 1957, Stompanato followed Lana Turner to a film set in England, and what he did there, in front of an entire cast and crew in broad daylight, would begin to reveal what he actually was. Not the man in the import-export business, not the answer Lana Turner had been looking for, something else entirely. The man who called himself John Steele had a real name, a real employer, and a real professional history, none of which he had mentioned at the dinner in Los Angeles where he and Lana Turner met in late 1956. His name was Johnny Stompanato. He was born in Woodstock, Illinois in 1925, the son of a barber, and he had found his way into the Los Angeles criminal landscape through the route that many men of his particular temperament found during the post-war years. Military service, followed by a return to civilian life that civilian life was not especially equipped to absorb. He was physically imposing, deliberate in his manner, and possessed of a professional composure that he had refined over several years in the service of Mickey Cohen, one of the most of prominent organized crime figures operating out of Los Angeles in the late 1940s and 1950s. Cohen ran protection rackets, illegal gambling operations, and a network of associates that extended across the city and into its entertainment margins. Stompanato worked for Cohen in the capacity that Cohen's organization required, the kind of work that a corporation does not put on the org chart but cannot function without. He was, by the plainest description available, an enforcer, a man whose professional value lay in the willingness and ability to make people understand what they were and were not permitted to do. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew him in this period, exceptionally skilled at a second profession, identifying wealthy women in the entertainment industry and making himself appear with considerable patience and craft to be exactly what they had been looking for. He ran these two activities in parallel. They were not as separate as they might appear. What Stompanato offered in the early stages of any relationship was the specific sensation of being chosen by someone who seemed immune to ordinary pressure. A man who did not defer, did not hesitate, and did not appear to need anything from you except your company. For a woman who had been managed by a studio since the age of 16, who had spent 2 decades having her image approved and her schedule arranged by other people's decisions, the sensation of being wanted by a man who appeared to answer to no one was, in the particular psychology of Lana Turner's circumstances, precisely intoxicating. The relationship moved quickly. By early 1957, he was a fixture in her life, present at her home on North Bedford Drive, informed of her schedule, and attentive in the way that, at a certain distance, resembles devotion and, at a closer distance, resembles surveillance. In the autumn of 1957, Lana Turner left for England to film Another Time, Another Place, a wartime romance shooting on location in the British countryside. Her co-star was a 27-year-old Scottish actor named Sean Connery, then in the middle years of a career that had not yet found its definitive shape. He was broad-shouldered, unhurried, and constitutionally unimpressed by the apparatus of Hollywood celebrity. Stompanato was not on the call sheet. He came anyway. He arrived in England unannounced and made his presence felt on the film set with the directness of a man who considered Connery's proximity to Lana Turner a problem requiring immediate resolution. On at least one occasion, documented in contemporary reports and confirmed by accounts from the production, Stompanato produced a firearm on the set and directed it at Connery. Connery took the gun from his hand. The accounts of exactly how this happened differ in minor details, but not in substance. Connery stepped forward and removed the weapon from Stompanato with the calm of a man who had decided, in that moment, not to be afraid of him. The crew stood still. The confrontation ended. Scotland Yard was contacted. Within days, British immigration authorities escorted Johnny Stompanato to the airport and placed him on a flight back to the United States. He was not permitted to return. Lana Turner stayed in England and finished the film. She did not end the relationship. She was 36 years old and had been conditioned through 20 years of studio management and 4 marriages to treat the authority of men as something to be accommodated rather than refused, even when that authority arrived in a form that pulled a weapon in front of a film crew and had to be physically removed by a co-star. The machinery of how she understood herself had been running on a specific set of inputs since 1937, and the deportation of Johnny Stompanato from England did not, in itself, provide her with a different set. He was waiting in Los Angeles when she returned. The dynamic that followed the England incident was not the chastened withdrawal of a man who understood he had gone too far. It was the escalation of one. The monitoring of her schedule intensified. His presence at the house on North Bedford Drive became more insistent. The accounting of where she was, who she had spoken to, and what she intended to do next became, by the testimony of those closest to her in this period, a kind of continuous audit. The work of a man who had decided that Lana Turner was a possession and that possessions required management. The threats began in this period as well. According to testimony given at the inquest that would take place the following spring, Stompanato told Lana Turner that he would disfigure her face, that he would destroy the one thing the studio had spent 20 years building and the industry had spent 20 years selling, if she attempted to leave him. He told her he would do the same to her daughter. The studio had spent 20 years making Lana Turner into someone men would want to own. One of them had finally arrived to collect. Cheryl Crane was 14 years old. She was living in the house on North Bedford Drive. She was old enough and had been through enough to understand the pattern she was watching. She had already learned, in the years with Lex Barker, that the men her mother chose moved through the household with an authority that no one checked at the door. She had already learned that the revelation of what that authority could mean produced apology and divorce, but not protection. Not the permanent, structural, institutional kind of protection that might have prevented the next man from walking in with the same license. She was watching Stompanato now. She was listening to the arguments that came through the walls at night. She was calculating, with the particular precision of a child who has learned to treat safety as an arithmetic problem, whether the current situation was the same as what had come before, or whether it was something that required a different kind of answer. By March of 1958, she had her answer. The only question left was who would act on it. Good Friday falls on the 4th of April in the year 1958. In Beverly Hills, on a street called North Bedford Drive, in a house at number 730, the evening begins with an argument. The precise sequence of what was said, in what order, at what volume, in what room, is known primarily through the testimony Lana Turner and Cheryl Crane gave at the inquest 1 week later, and through the account Cheryl Crane would set down in her memoir 30 years after that. What the testimony establishes, and what the inquest jury accepted, is this. The argument followed a familiar pattern, and the pattern had been escalating for months. And on the night of April 4th, it arrived somewhere it had not quite reached before. According to Lana Turner's inquest testimony, Stompanato told her he would cut her face, that he would do to her the one thing the studio had spent 20 years making economically unthinkable, which was to make her unrecognizable, and therefore unemployable, and therefore his in the only way that remained available. He told her he would hurt her daughter as well. These threats are reported through testimony and memoir and cannot be corroborated by independent third-party documentation. They are, however, consistent with the pattern the record had already established across the preceding months. The monitoring, the control, the England incident, the deportation that produced not withdrawal but acceleration. Consistent, in other words, with what the man had already shown, under observation, that he was. Cheryl Crane was in her room when the argument began. She was 14 years old. According to her memoir, she listened through the wall, made a calculation, and went to the kitchen. She took a kitchen knife. She walked down the hallway to her mother's bedroom door. What happened at that door is the central documented fact of this story. Johnny Stompanato died of a single stab wound to the abdomen. He was 32 years old. The time was approximately 9:30 in the evening of Good Friday, April 4, 1958, at 730 North Bedford Drive, Beverly Hills, California. What happened in the hours immediately following is where the story of the system becomes visible. Before the Los Angeles Police Department had concluded its investigation of the scene, before the body had left the premises, a man named Jerry Giesler arrived at the house. Giesler was not a family friend, not a neighbor, and not a private citizen who had heard the news and rushed over out of personal concern. He was one of the most prominent criminal defense attorneys in Los Angeles, a man whose prior clients had included Charlie Chaplin, Errol Flynn, and Bugsy Siegel, and whose relationship to the major Hollywood studios was, in the professional vocabulary of the time, understood without needing to be stated. He had been called. The record does not specify by whom or through which precise channel. The record specifies only that he was there. The police investigation proceeded in a house that already contained, before it concluded, a representative of the institution that had built Lana Turner into a commercial property and held a material interest in what the public record would subsequently reflect. The studio's first move, when the product was in danger, was narrative control. No one from the studio called to ask about Cheryl Crane. Mickey Cohen learned of Stompanato's death through the networks available to him. He moved with the efficiency that characterized his professional life. From the belongings Stompanato had kept at his own residence, letters, personal documents, the kind of material that accumulates around a man who understood that information was a form of leverage, Cohen recovered the correspondence that Lana Turner had written to Johnny Stompanato over the course of their relationship. He sold it to the newspapers. The letters were, by any ordinary standard, private. They were private in the specific way that the interior life of America's most photographed woman was private, which is to say, conditionally, and at the pleasure of whoever happened to hold the documents. By the morning after the death, the contents of Lana Turner's most personal correspondence were in the hands of editors, photographers, and typesetters, reproduced in broadsheets across the country with the granularity that only original documents provide. She had written them believing they would be read by one man. She was wrong about that by a margin of several million. Now run the arithmetic of this particular week. Lana Turner had spent 20 years allowing a studio to manage what the public knew about her. She had surrendered her name, her image, and her schedule to an institutional machinery that operated on the premise that the commodity, the face, the brand, the concept that was Lana Turner, was more valuable than the person inside it. That machinery had failed to protect her daughter from Lex Barker. It had failed to provide her with any mechanism for removing Johnny Stompanato from her life in the months when the pattern was already visible and the outcome was already calculable. When the crisis finally arrived, the machinery moved immediately, not to protect her, but to protect the investment. The inquest was scheduled for April 11th, 1958, 7 days after the death. 7 days in which the stolen letters continued to circulate, the photographs ran in every major paper, and the question of what had happened in the hallway at 730 North Bedford Drive settled into a story with parts already distributed. The gangster, the actress, the daughter, the studio attorney who had arrived first. The verdict still formally outstanding. On the morning of April 11th, Lana Turner would walk into a Los Angeles courtroom in a gray suit and take her place at the witness stand. A prosecutor would read her letters aloud, the ones Mickey Cohen had sold, the ones written in the privacy of a correspondence she had trusted to a dead man, in front of reporters, spectators, and a gallery that included, by several accounts, associates of Cohen himself. She had given the best performances of her career on studio lots, with controlled lighting and the option of additional takes. She would have none of those here. The courtroom on April 11th, 1958, was full before 9 in the morning. Reporters had taken the available press seats and were standing along the walls. Members of the public who had obtained access were watching from the gallery. The photographers who had been permitted near the entrance had already established that Lana Turner had arrived in a gray suit, that she was composed, and that she was not looking at anyone in particular. The love letters were already in the record. What remained was the testimony. She took the witness stand. What followed in the subsequent hours has been described in 2 ways by the people who were present and the historians who have examined it since. Some have described it as the finest dramatic performance of Lana Turner's professional life, a piece of controlled emotional delivery that was, in its precision and its timing, superior to anything she had produced on a soundstage. Others have argued, with equal seriousness, that it was nothing of the kind, that what the jury witnessed was simply a frightened woman telling the truth about what she had lived through, without artifice and without construction, in the only language available to her. What is not disputed is the effect. She described the months of the relationship in language that was specific and sequential. She described the monitoring, the threats, the England incident, the return to Los Angeles, the escalation that had made the house on North Bedford Drive feel, by the spring of 1958, like a location she was no longer certain she was permitted to leave. She described, in testimony that has been on the public record for 68 years, what Stompanato had told her he would do to her face, what he had told her he would do to her daughter. While she testified, a prosecutor read excerpts from the letters Mickey Cohen had sold, the letters she had written in private. The letters reproduced in newspapers across the country for the preceding week. She sat at the witness stand while her own words, the interior words, the ones that live in correspondence precisely because they are too exposed to speak aloud, were read aloud, in a room full of strangers, because a dead man's employer had decided they were worth money. She did not flinch. She did not look at the letters. The jury deliberated for 25 minutes. The verdict was justifiable homicide. Cheryl Crane, 14 years old, had acted within the law. The law acknowledged what she had done. The law placed no criminal finding against her. The law had, in its formal language, confirmed that the decision she had made in the hallway with a kitchen knife was the correct one. Then the state of California sent her to El Retiro School for Girls. El Retiro was a juvenile facility in the San Fernando Valley, a residential institution for girls whose situations the courts had determined required supervision. The girls who lived there had, in most cases, done things that the ordinary categories of childhood could not accommodate. Cheryl Crane moved in during the summer of 1958. The San Fernando Valley in summer sits under a heat that arrives early and stays late, and the dormitory windows faced east, away from the city. She was 14 years old and had been found innocent of a crime the court had determined she had not committed. She was in a reform school. The reasoning, such as it was, appears to have rested on a judicial judgment that Cheryl Crane's home environment was not one from which a stable adolescence could emerge, a judgment that was, by any objective accounting, accurate. What the judgment did not acknowledge was that the home environment in question had been the product of decisions made by a studio, a series of men, a legal and social system that had absorbed the abuse of Lex Barker without consequence and the threats of Johnny Stompanato without intervention, and that had waited until a 14-year-old girl solved the problem with a kitchen knife before deciding that what the situation required was institutional supervision of the 14-year-old girl. Now consider what happened 8 months later. In the spring of 1959, Universal Pictures released Imitation of Life, a melodrama directed by Douglas Sirk and starring Lana Turner as a woman so consumed by the ambition to become a famous actress that she loses her connection to her daughter, while the daughter grows up without her. Ross Hunter, the film's producer, had cast Lana Turner in the role because he believed, correctly as it turned out, that the events of April 1958 had not destroyed the audience's appetite for her. He believed they had, if anything, enlarged it. He was right. Imitation of Life grossed $6.4 million domestically. It was nominated for 2 Golden Globes. It became, by any measure, the largest commercial success of Lana Turner's career. She played a woman who sacrificed her daughter for the lights. America bought millions of tickets to watch it. Cheryl Crane watched the spring of 1959 from a dormitory in the San Fernando Valley, where the heat came early and the windows faced east, and the city, with its premieres and its columns and its careful management of what the public was permitted to know, was somewhere in the middle distance. The studio had built Lana Turner into a product. The product, as it turned out, was indestructible. The girl in the hallway was another matter. The years after El Retiro were not simple, but they were hers. Cheryl Crane eventually settled in Palm Springs, where she built a life in real estate, a profession that requires, among other things, the ability to walk through other people's houses and understand, quickly and without sentiment, what they conceal and what they are worth. She did not become a public figure in the conventional sense. She gave occasional interviews over the decades. She spoke carefully. She carried the night of April 4th, 1958, with the specific precision of someone who has decided not to set it down. Not because they cannot, but because setting it down would change what it weighs. In 1988, she published her memoir. She called it Detour, a Hollywood Story. She told it in her own voice, in her own sequence, without the assistance of a studio publicity department, a fixer attorney, or a man who might sell the letters afterward. She described what Lex Barker had done inside the house on North Bedford Drive. She described what she had heard through the wall on Good Friday night. She described the kitchen, the knife, the hallway. "I didn't go in there to kill him," she wrote. "I went in there to tell him to stop." Lana Turner married 3 more times after Johnny Stompanato died. None of the marriages lasted. The career continued. Further films, a television series, nightclub engagements in Las Vegas, the specific durability of a commercial identity that had been engineered to outlast the woman inside it. She died in Los Angeles on June 29, 1995, of throat cancer. She was 74 years old. The studio had long since closed the file. She had been America's most photographed woman for 20 years. She had been seen, in the precise, manufactured way that the industry produces visibility, by tens of millions of people who believed, in the way that audiences believe, that they knew her. In the end, what she was and what she was worth was not decided by the studio that named her, or by the men who moved through the house, or by the columns that described her marriages, or by the screen on which her face had appeared in the dark for 2 decades. It was decided by a 14-year-old girl standing in a hallway. The girl is still alive. The hallway is still there.